In the year 874 AD, a master blacksmith named Ulfr stood before the great Jarl Ragnar's war council. His hands, scarred from decades at the forge, trembled not from the heat of molten iron, but from pure terror. The Jarl's finest sword had shattered in battle, costing them victory and the lives of 30 warriors. The punishment for such failure? Death. But here's what history books won't tell you. Ulfr wasn't the first blacksmith to face execution that year. In fact, being a Viking blacksmith, the very backbone of Norse society, was one of the most dangerous professions of the Viking Age. Not because of the obvious hazards of fire and molten metal, but because these craftsmen walked a razor's edge between being revered as near magical beings and being killed for knowing too much, failing their lords, or simply being too valuable to let live. Today, we're diving deep into the dark, untold story of Viking blacksmiths, men who could forge the weapons that conquered nations, but who lived every day knowing that their skills could be their death sentence. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these masters of metal were simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable members of Viking society. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, was built on iron and blood. Every raid, every conquest, every legendary saga, none of it would have been possible without the blacksmith. Yet, while we celebrate Viking warriors and their legendary weapons, like Gram and Skofnung, we rarely talk about the men who made them, and more importantly, why so many of them met violent ends. I'm going to share with you 5 major reasons why being a Viking blacksmith was essentially signing your own death warrant, backed by archaeological evidence, saga accounts, and discoveries that historians have only recently begun to understand. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how important and dangerous these craftsmen really were. In Norse mythology, the gods themselves feared the blacksmith. Wayland the smith, the legendary master craftsman, was so skilled that King Nithuther had him captured and hamstrung, literally crippling him by cutting his hamstrings to prevent his escape. Why? Because a blacksmith who could forge divine weapons was too dangerous to roam free. This wasn't just mythology, it reflected real Viking attitudes. Blacksmiths were believed to possess supernatural knowledge. They could turn raw earth into weapons. They knew the secrets of carbon and steel centuries before modern chemistry. They understood the sacred rituals that transformed mere metal into soul-bound weapons. Archaeological evidence from Hedeby and Birka shows us that Viking blacksmiths were creating pattern-welded steel, what we incorrectly call Damascus steel, using techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for another 500 years. Dr. Anne Stalsberg's analysis of Viking swords found that the best smiths were incorporating precise carbon contents between 0.4 and 0.8%, creating differential heat treatments that modern metallurgists struggle to replicate, even with our technology. But here's where it gets dark. This knowledge was so valuable that smiths were often killed to prevent rivals from learning their secrets. The Orkneyinga saga tells of Thorkel the smith, who was murdered by Earl Einar specifically because he refused to reveal how he created unbreakable mail rings. His workshop was burned, his apprentices scattered or killed, all to ensure his techniques died with him. In 2019, excavations at Trelleborg Fortress in Denmark uncovered something chilling: the remains of what appears to be a blacksmith, buried with his tools, and clear evidence of ritual execution. The positioning of the body, face down with a stone placed on the back, matches other dangerous dead burials where Vikings feared the deceased might return. Professor Neil Price from Uppsala University suggests this was common. Blacksmiths who knew too much about weapons used against their own people, or who were suspected of cursing blades, were ritually killed and buried in ways that would prevent their spirits from seeking revenge. Imagine you're a master blacksmith in 9th century Norway. Your jarl commissions you to forge weapons for a raid on a neighboring settlement. You craft beautiful swords, strong enough to cleave through shields. The raid is successful, but now the neighboring jarl knows who made those weapons. He wants you to work for him. What do? Refuse, and he might kill you to deny your skills to his enemies. Accept, and your original lord will definitely kill you for betrayal. This wasn't hypothetical. The Landnámabók records at least 3 instances of smiths being executed for divided loyalty. Here's something fascinating. The Frankish Empire had strict laws prohibiting the sale of weapons to Vikings. The Capitulary of Boulogne in 811 AD specifically banned selling swords to Northmen under penalty of death, but archaeological evidence shows Frankish swords all over Scandinavia. How? Viking raiders would capture Frankish smiths and force them to work. These smiths faced an impossible choice: create weapons for their captors and be considered traitors if they ever returned home, or refuse and die immediately. Many chose a third option: sabotage. They would create flawed weapons designed to fail in battle. When discovered, the punishment was horrific. The Annals of Ulster record that in 847 AD, a captured smith who sabotaged weapons had molten silver poured into his eyes before being burned alive, a warning to other craftsmen about the price of deception. Many blacksmiths were actually slaves, captured from raids across Europe. These thralls possessed invaluable skills but occupied the lowest social position. The saga of Eric the Red mentions Thorgest's smith, a Celtic slave who forged exceptional weapons but was killed the moment his master suspected he was planning escape. Archaeological evidence from Coppergate in York shows workshop areas where enslaved smiths worked under guard. Isotope analysis of buried remains indicates many were indeed foreign-born, likely captured craftsmen. These men lived knowing that their skills kept them alive, but also that they would never be trusted enough to gain freedom. Viking smiths didn't just work with iron. They were also goldsmiths, silversmiths, and most dangerously, they worked with mercury for gilding. Fire gilding, the process of using mercury amalgam to gold plate items, slowly poisoned smiths over years. Modern analysis of smith burials from Uppåkra in Sweden shows mercury levels 50 times higher than normal in their bones. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, personality changes, hallucinations, and eventually death. Vikings called it the smith's curse and believed it was punishment from the gods for working with divine metals. Dr. Rayleigh Almay's groundbreaking study of Viking Age remains in Estonia found that smiths had lead concentrations in their bones, averaging 280 parts per million, enough to cause severe neurological damage. Lead poisoning from working with pewter and lead-based alloys caused aggression, paranoia, and cognitive decline. Imagine the scenario. A smith becomes increasingly paranoid and aggressive due to lead poisoning. His behavior becomes erratic. In a society where any sign of madness could be interpreted as possession or curse, these poisoned smiths often met violent ends, killed by communities who feared them. Viking forges produced massive amounts of carbon monoxide, while modern blacksmiths work in well-ventilated areas. Viking smithies were often semi-underground or in longhouses during winter. Experimental archaeology by Daryl Markowitz showed that CO levels in reconstructed Viking forges could reach 800 parts per million, enough to cause death within hours. The Erbygja saga mentions smiths who fell asleep at their anvils and never woke. We now know this was likely carbon monoxide poisoning, but Vikings interpreted it as the gods claiming smiths who had grown too proud of their skills. A master smith could produce a pattern-welded sword worth 16 milk cows, equivalent to roughly $50,000 in today's money. A smith who could consistently produce such weapons was essentially a walking mint. Lords would rather kill a smith than let him work for rivals. The Laxdæla saga tells of Thorstein's smith who asked to buy his freedom after years of service. Instead of granting it, Thorstein had him killed, reasoning that the smith knew too much about his wealth and weapons to be allowed to leave. When a master smith died, his knowledge often died with him. Sons didn't automatically inherit their father's skills. It took years of training. This created a perverse incentive. Rival smiths would sometimes arrange accidents for masters who hadn't fully trained successors, eliminating competition while ensuring certain techniques remained secret. Archaeological evidence from Helgo shows a workshop that was suddenly abandoned around 850 AD, with valuable tools left behind. Nearby, excavators found remains of what appears to be the smith and his two apprentices, all killed by sword wounds. The pattern suggests a targeted assassination rather than a raid. Successful smiths needed protection, but protection came at a price. They had to affiliate with powerful jarls or war bands, essentially becoming property. The moment their protector died or lost power, smiths were vulnerable. The Sturlunga saga records multiple instances of smiths being killed during power transitions, either by new rulers who didn't trust them or by departing forces who didn't want to leave such valuable assets behind. Vikings believed weapons could be cursed or blessed during forging. A smith who created a sword that failed in battle wasn't just guilty of poor craftsmanship, he might be accused of deliberately cursing the blade. The saga of the Volsungs mentions the sword Gram being reforged 3 times, with the suggestion that previous smiths were killed for their failures. Even more dangerous was the concept of blood vengeance. If a sword killed an important person, their family might seek revenge not just on the wielder, but on the smith who forged it. The Njals saga references this practice, where the smith Thorkel was hunted down and killed 3 years after forging the spear that killed Gunnar. Berserkers, Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, had a special relationship with smiths. They believed their strength came partly from their weapons, which needed special rituals during forging. Smiths who worked for berserkers were essentially tied to them for life. Professor Anatoly Kirpichnikov's study of Viking weapons found that many berserker blades had unusual compositions, including trace amounts of phosphorus that made the steel harder but more brittle. Some historians suggest smiths added these deliberately, creating weapons that would eventually fail, freeing them from service. When caught, the punishment was brutal. The Haraldskvaði mentions a smith being blood-eagled for betraying berserker warriors. Named after Wayland, Volund, the smith, this was the practice of deliberately maiming talented smiths to prevent escape. Archaeological evidence from Gotland shows remains of smiths with deliberately broken legs that had healed poorly, consistent with hamstringing. These crippled smiths lived as prestigious prisoners, creating masterworks while being unable to flee. The psychological toll was enormous. The Thithorex saga mentions several smiths who chose death rather than accept such mutilation, throwing themselves into their forges rather than becoming enslaved craftsmen. So what happened to Ulfr, our smith from the beginning? The sagas tell us he did something unprecedented. He challenged Jarl Ragnar to single combat, invoking his right as a free man. He knew he would die, but by dying in combat rather than execution, he ensured his family wouldn't bear the shame of his failure. His son would continue the smithing tradition, learning from his father's sacrifice. The Viking Age ended not with the last raid or the final battle, but perhaps when the last of these master smiths passed their secrets to apprentices without fear of death. Today, we marvel at Viking weapons in museums, the Ulfbert swords, the pattern-welded spearheads, the perfectly balanced axes, but we should remember that each piece represents not just metallurgical mastery, but survival against incredible odds. Modern blacksmiths work safely in ventilated shops, free to share knowledge and techniques. Viking smiths lived knowing that their next creation could be their last, that their knowledge made them targets, and that the very act of creation carried the seed of their destruction. The next time you see a Viking sword in a museum, remember, you're not just looking at a weapon, you're looking at a survival story of a craftsman who managed to create something beautiful while navigating political intrigue, supernatural fear, toxic exposure, and the constant threat of death. These smiths weren't just metalworkers, they were artists, chemists, diplomats, and survivors in one of history's most violent ages. Their hammers have long since fallen silent, but their legacy rings on in every piece of Viking steel that survived the centuries, each one a testament to the men who risked everything to master the transformation of Earth into legend. What other dark secrets of the Viking Age would you like to explore? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories.